Close your eyes and imagine a quiet morning in ancient China. The sun hasn't fully risen, and a soft fog curls over the tiled rooftops of a Han Dynasty household. Somewhere in a humble stone kitchen, a cook is stirring porridge over a glowing hearth, not hurriedly, but with the slow rhythm of someone who has done this for decades. In her hand is a small linen pouch, and inside, a handful of tiny, tingly berries called huajiao. They don't shout, they whisper. Just a pinch will do tonight. We'll take a slow walk through the kitchens of 2,000 years ago to explore how ancient spices like huajiao quietly shaped the taste of breakfast, one gentle tingling mouthful at a time. Chapter 1. A bowl of warm millet and the buzz of Sichuan pepper. You wake up in a dusty village just outside the city walls of Chang'an. Sometime in the 1st century BCE, it's early. The sky is still indigo, but a faint line of gold has begun tracing its way across the eastern hills. Somewhere beyond the paper-thin walls of a modest wooden home, a rooster announces his predictable astonishment that morning has arrived again. You lie still on the woven straw mat, listening to the faint rustle of coals being stirred back to life. Breakfast in the Han Dynasty does not come in boxes or with jingles. It arrives slowly built from last night's ashes and this morning's patience. And most often, it begins with millet. The cook today, an aging grandmother with loose, silver hair tucked under a linen wrap, has already slipped outside to the earthen stove. She moves with the quiet certainty of someone who's prepared thousands of morning meals, not just for nourishment, but for rhythm. Water from a heavy clay jar is ladled carefully into a battered bronze pot. The fire beneath it flickers awake, fed by twigs and dried mulberry branches, filling the air with soft smoke and a tinge of resin. Millet, once considered humble and hardy, isn't simply boiled. Not here, not now. A good breakfast deserves more than boiling. This morning, the millet will be steamed slowly in bamboo baskets, its grains fattening and glistening until they swell into golden pearls. But the real treasure, barely visible on a nearby shelf, is the spice. It's called huajiao, known today as Sichuan peppercorn, though it's not truly a pepper. It's a husk, a twist of citrus and electric tingle bundled into one. In the Han kitchen, it sits in a lacquered bowl, dry, reddish-brown, and crinkled like forgotten berries. It doesn't taste spicy in the modern sense. It numbs, it hums, and it leaves a delicate aftershock in the mouth like distant thunder. Back then, huajiao wasn't used generously. It was stored carefully, traded by weight, and crushed only in pinches. A little went a long way. You didn't cover your food with it. You invited it in, respectfully, like a whisper of mountain wind in a still room. As the millet softens, the grandmother takes a few seeds of huajiao, gently roasting them on a dry pan to release their oils. You can smell it even before. You see the faint steam rise, lemony, woody, with a tingle that climbs the nose and makes your eyes water, just slightly. This spice had traveled, not across oceans, but through valleys and rivers, from the southern forests of Bashu modern Sichuan to markets far north. It was carried on the backs of men, in sacks tied with hemp cords, passed hand to hand in exchange for cloth, salt, or writing brushes. And before that, it lived in silence, clinging to thorny shrubs in mist-wrapped mountains, waiting for someone to recognize its strange electricity. The grandmother mixes a tiny bit of crushed huajiao with ginger and vinegar, pouring it gently over chopped greens. This is not a main dish, it's a condiment, a note. Something sharp to contrast the warmth of the millet and the sweetness of pickled radish. The family begins to gather slowly, wordlessly. A boy in a cotton robe sits cross-legged. A younger girl, still blinking sleep from her eyes, clutches a doll made of wrapped straw. They don't talk much. Mornings in Han homes are often quiet. Words like spices are reserved. There's no table. Just a low platform with ceramic bowls, each different in age and shape. No one's bowl matches another's. A ladle dips into the pot and steam escapes like breath. The millet is spooned into bowls with pickled vegetables, a trace of huajiao dressing, and sometimes, if the household is lucky, a preserved egg or dried tofu on the side. There is no ceremony, but there is still reverence. A warmth that stretches beyond the food. A recognition that this quiet act, eating together before a day of labor, sets the tone for all that follows. Outside, carts begin to rumble down the stone roads, their wooden wheels groaning like old bones. Somewhere a neighbor is hammering a saddle. A student in blue robes recites Confucian verse. Life in the Han Dynasty is waking up, but in this small kitchen, the taste of huajiao lingers. It's not dramatic, it's not spicy even, it's just present. A whisper on the tongue. A reminder of mountain groves, of trade routes through bamboo forests, of the many unseen hands that brought this strange husk from wild shrub to morning bowl. The children don't think about any of this. They just chew and wipe their faces with. Sleeves too long for their arms. But you new to this morning, new to this century, you wonder, how many breakfasts began like this? How many quiet mornings were once punctuated by the fizz of huajiao, long before anyone thought to write it down? And what other forgotten spices sat beside this one, now lost to time, their names faded from the scrolls? Chapter 2. Spice merchants, sleepy markets, and the scented ink of bureaucracy. The path to the market. The kitchen's fire had quieted by the time the first carts began to roll past Liu Yun's doorway. Roosters in the alley crowed with casual laziness, and the coal smoke drifted upward in thin, listless plumes. Having tended to the morning broth and sorted her clay jars of condiments, Liu Yun tied her modest traveling wrap over her shoulders and stepped out with a lidded basket of tofu and millet buns nestled in her arms. But today, her walk had a second purpose. She was searching for more huajiao, that sharp, tingling spice, what the bureaucrats called xanthoxylum piperitum, but what commoners simply called numbing pepper, was increasingly rare these past seasons. There had been a bad storm downriver in the Bashu region. The merchants said the peppercorn boats were delayed, their burlap sacks sitting idle at some flooded toll gate, where tax collectors sniffed every crate as if searching for stolen flavor. So, Liu Yun walked slowly through the morning market, eyes scanning for the telltale red cords merchants tied to baskets of spice. Her feet brushed against the smooth-worn stone street, past bronze-scaled fish sellers calling out weight by handfuls, and children playing with reed-wrapped spinning tops near a stack of dried lotus roots. The market was not loud, but it was not quiet either. It moved at the pace of congee, simmering, measured, habitual. Spice sellers laid their trays carefully, the same way clerks laid scrolls on lacquered desks. There was little yelling, only the rustle of scales, the flip of drying mats, the murmur of trades that needed no haggling. Every price was already known. Liu Yun paused before an older man seated on a folding stool near the wall of the Temple of Agricultural Rites. He had 3 baskets of spices. Arrayed before him, ginger slices like curled bark, crushed fennel held in old tea tins, and there in the smallest bowl, a scattering of deep rust-colored huajiao, bashu grown. She asked softly, pointing. He shook his head. Tangshi, lower tongue. No teeth, this was local slang. Bashu huajiao numbed the lips and left a citrusy echo. The Tangshi variety was milder, less fire, less frost. Cheaper, but still useful. She bartered a small pouch in exchange for 2 millet buns and a smear of apricot paste. The man grunted, folded the bun into a leaf, and gestured lazily at the temple bell, just starting to ring the hour. It was the 2nd quarter before noon. She needed to hurry. The scented scrolls of the inner bureau, a short walk from the market's boundary, past a row of silent bamboo trellises, and a tethered donkey chewing cud near a mirror-polished copper basin, lay the southern annex of the county magistrate's office. The outer courtyard had the scent of moldy reed mats and fresh ink. Liu Yun was not just a cook. Once a week, she was summoned to deliver broth to the inner bureau's scribes, a tedious ritual arranged not out of generosity, but necessity. The scribes, overworked and pale, suffered frequent stomach ailments from months of bad tea and overcooked beans. Her morning soup was rumored to settle even the most stubbornly cramped stomach, and more importantly, they pay her in scraps of discarded documents. To her, this was treasure. She never learned to write. But her son, if the temple instructor could be trusted, showed a strange, patient fondness for brushstrokes. So she used the spicy leftovers of civil bureaucracy to teach him. Paper was expensive, but error-ridden drafts from the tax office were not. She passed through the outer gate, nodding to the silent guards beneath the stone lintel, and walked through the tiled corridor. It smelled of old rice starch, dusty string-bound. Ledgers and ink thickened with soot. Inside, the scribes sat on short stools with slumped posture, their hair bound into slightly crooked topknots. None looked older than 30. Most looked exhausted. "Pepper broth," she whispered, sliding the lidded clay container across the lacquered table. "And scallion root. I left out the garlic this time," one scribe nodded. Another muttered, "Your pepper numbs better than the magistrate's seal." She laughed under her breath and waited. Moments later, a balding clerk named Sue dug into his scroll bin and handed her a small bundle. Useless to them, precious to her. There was a torn civil complaint about water theft and a duplicated market record, hastily stamped and rejected. Lu Yun bowed and left. Outside, the sun was already casting long, soft-edged shadows, and the afternoon wind stirred loose strands of her hair, the spice that wasn't a spice. Back in her kitchen, Lu Yun prepared the midday porridge with millet, shredded pickled turnip, and a single pinch of her newly acquired huajiao. She sniffed it once more, noting the lesser quality. Not quite the electric sparkle of the bashu kind, but still sharp enough to lift the edge of fatigue. She often thought of how strange the pepper was. Technically not a pepper at all. It wasn't like the black pepper imported from the mysterious western regions, nor the fiery chili peppers the sailors whispered about. Those hadn't even reached China yet. No, huajiao was its own mystery. A dried outer husk of a prickly ash seed, not even the seed itself. It numbed the mouth instead of burning it. Tingled instead of flamed. Some of the elders said it was used to ward off ghosts. Others swore it sharpened dreams. The herbalists called it mildly warming and prescribed it for wind-cold invasions. But to Liu Yun, it was a thing of habit. It belonged in broth, the way warmth belonged in winter, or the way scrolls belonged to silence. A brief visit from old Jia that afternoon, while the porridge simmered on the clay stove and her son practiced writing numbers on a scrap of tax rejection form. Old Jia visited. He was a retired herbalist who lived downwind of the vinegar yard and smelled perpetually of fermented rice. He eyed her huajiao pouch with interest. "Tangshi," he sniffed. "Dull tongue," she raised an eyebrow. "Still better than boiled nettle root," he grunted. Barely then, without asking, he dropped a few dried chun pie-aged tangerine peel into her broth pot and stirred with a ladle. For balance, he muttered, "Next time ask," she said mildly, but she let him sit. He always shared stories when the tangerine peel was added. Today's story was about a civil servant in the Eastern Han court who had tried to regulate spice weights by ordering all pepper sellers to measure only with stone counters and not bronze. Ones claiming metal skewed the weights when near fire. It had caused a small revolt among kitchen guilds. They tried to take his seal and boil it in wine, Jia said with a soft chuckle. And when he refused to apologize, the cooks refused to serve him. The man was exiled for interfering with breakfast. Lu Yun smiled. She liked stories where food won, a question stirring in the steam that night, as the embers in the hearth dimmed and the clay walls of her kitchen breathed out their stored warmth. Lu Yun sat with her son by the candlelight. He copied numbers slowly, the scent of huajiao still faint on their fingers. She looked at the small paper scrap he practiced on, a fragment of a land deed that once determined the rice allotment for an entire village. Now it was ink-stained with the character for 5 written 10 times. She wondered about the path these forgotten spices had taken. From thorny trees in mountain provinces to paper bowls in cramped kitchens. From overland mule caravans to bureaucratic record books. Why were some spices treasured and others forgotten? What caused one flavor to fade while another remained? As she blew out the candle, the thought lingered like the numbing aftertaste of the pepper itself. What stories did the spices still carry in their silent burn? Chapter 3. When Spice was a whisper, not a roar. By mid-morning in the Han Dynasty kitchen, the delicate rhythms of cooking were beginning to draw to a close. The hearth had dimmed to a soft bed of glowing embers, and the cook's footsteps, once purposeful, now moved with a practiced ease born of repetition. Breakfast had been served, and the house was slowly beginning to stir in its own way quietly, without fanfare. But while the meal was gone, the flavors lingered. That faint tingling on the tongue from the huajiao was still being quietly debated by the family elders in the next room. One thought it too bold. Another remembered her mother's millet porridge had used even more of it during the Great Snow of 153 BC. The cook, however, had already moved on, returning the little cloth pouch of dried huajiao berries to its lacquered box and placing it with care in the shadowed recess of the spice shelf. Not because it was rare, but because it was important. It was, after all, a spice for morning. Conversations, not evening stews. A pantry of whispering spices. In Han China, kitchens were not simply spaces for cooking. They were quiet stages for daily rituals that reflected the pace and preferences of an entire civilization. Among the clutter of ladles and steam baskets, one would find an unexpectedly careful system of organization, particularly when it came to spices. Some, like ginger root or dried orange peel, were kept in open baskets. Others, like huajiao, star anise, and cassia bark, were carefully sealed in clay jars or wooden boxes, away from dampness, sunlight, and time the cook might not think of herself as a scholar of flavor. But she understood what every good cook in the capital knew. Spices were not loud in the Han morning. They were muted background whispers, not declarations. Huajiao berries weren't the main taste. They were a sensation, a prickle that faded with tea, something that made one say, not ah. Aromatic decisions were not made lightly. A touch too much fennel seed, and the millet would taste oddly medicinal. Too little cassia bark and the yam porridge would seem limp and forgettable. The balance was invisible to most diners, but to the hands that stirred the congee, it was a form of quiet power. That's why the cook, whether a servant in a large household or a grandmother in a village home, would often pause for a long moment before pinching out a spice. She wasn't stalling. She was remembering trade winds and wooden spoons. By the 1st century BCE, China's trade routes had begun their long and winding stretch westward. The Proto-Silk Road, not yet fully named but already crucial, meant that spices could travel not quickly and not without expense, but they could. Even so, for most Han kitchens, the exotic remained mostly rumor. Clove, turmeric, and cardamom were rare guests, their names floating in from stories of merchants and physicians. The everyday flavor heroes were domestic, locally foraged, patiently dried, and quietly passed down through generations of mouths and memory. Many of them were not even called spices in the way we think of them today. They were roots and twigs, seeds and barks, ground by stone, soaked overnight, tied in cheesecloth, and removed before serving. They didn't arrive in shiny packaging or glass jars. They came in small linen sacks, woven by hand with handwritten ideograms stitched into the fabric in dull, fading ink. The knowledge of how to use these substances wasn't something taught in imperial manuals. It was conveyed through gestures and repetition. A grandmother guiding her daughter's hands, A muttered correction when too much dried garlic was added to the mung bean gruel. A nod of approval when the balance was just right. The morning meal was never a time for bold experiment. It was a moment of calm before the court hearings, before the market stalls opened, before the scholars and astrologers began their daily debates. The lingering fire, huajiao's gentle electric kiss so unlike. The roaring heat of modern chili was more than a taste. It was a feeling, the kind of sensory experience that stayed even after the meal was gone, humming softly at the corners of your mouth as you rinsed the bowls and set the stones to dry. To some in the capital, the tingling was associated with peasant kitchens and simple fare. But to others, particularly the older scholars who had once studied herbalism, it was proof of harmony. In traditional Chinese medicine, huajiao wasn't just for flavor, it was for balance. It was said to warm the middle burner to help the qi flow smoothly, especially in the colder months. Breakfast wasn't just nourishment, it was correction. A daily recalibration, and so the spice lingered, as all the best ones do. Not just on the tongue, but in the memories it stirred. A winter morning in your grandmother's house, when the rice cakes were warm and the windows fogged over with steam. A summer festival when pickled turnips laced with huajiao were served in clay dishes with wooden spoons. A moment between bites, where everything was quiet except the soft clink of a ladle and the hum of a waking household. The end of the morning. Not the flavor. As the morning shadows grew longer, the cook would finish her work. The pots were scrubbed with coarse rice husks, the ashes banked, and the cloths hung to dry. The kitchen, once alive with motion and smell, would return to silence until tomorrow. The huajiao, sealed again in its box, would sleep until its next awakening. And perhaps, later that day, someone would ask casually, "Was there huajiao in the porridge today?" They would touch their lips and smile faintly, the memory of the spice just barely still there. The ancient kitchens of the Han Dynasty never shouted, they whispered. And in those whispers were flavors that modern tongues, so used to noise, might hardly recognize. But if you listened, if you tasted slowly, you might hear them. Spices like huajiao spoke not of power, but of patience, of time, of quiet fire. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight on Quiet Boring Sleep. We hope this soft journey through forgotten spices and ancient breakfasts brought you a moment of peace, maybe even a little rest. If you enjoyed this quiet exploration of history, please consider gently tapping the like button, sharing it with a fellow night owl, and subscribing to Quiet Boring Sleep for more calming stories from the corners of the past. Until next time, sleep well. And may your dreams be full of silent kitchens and softly simmering pots.